Hello. I'm Regina Wandler, the Stewardship Director at the Land Trust, and I'm here with Dave Peterson, who is speaking with us today about healthy forests and how to think about creating resilient forests. Dave is joining us, and Dave has a lot of background in thinking about climate change science and resilient forestry. Dave has background as a professor at the University of Washington and as a research scientist at the Forest Service Research Station. Dave, thank you for making the time to chat with me today and to share your knowledge with everyone.
Thank you to you and Land Trust for being part of the program tonight. I really appreciate it.
We're here to chat a little bit, like I mentioned, about healthy forests today. Folks probably know Skagit Land Trust has protected over 10,000 acres, and we own over 2,500 acres of forest through the county. I think that's a very low number. I think it's a lot higher than that, actually. But that number is kind of what starts off this forests for us. So we get a lot of questions about what is a healthy forest and how we manage those. And I know that there are a lot of folks who are members who might be on this meeting with us tonight who are also trying to figure out how they can manage their own forests. You can see some images right now of healthy forests, maturing forests from different land trust properties and across Western Washington. There are a lot of different kinds of healthy forests on our properties. We have mature conifer forests, which I think a lot of folks in this area think of as the ultimate healthy forest, and it's what comes to mind. But we also have really wonderful and maturing floodplain forests, and there's some images of those as well. And that's something to keep in mind. A lot of the land trust properties are in the floodplain, so that floodplain forest is actually often what we're really thinking of when we're thinking of what we want our forests to become. And so there are a lot of things that go into a healthy forest.
Yeah, this slide suggests some things that we might think about as being part of a healthy forest. First of all, there's no recipe for this. There's no standard agreed upon definition. If you ask 10 different scientists or resource managers what they thought a healthy forest was, you get 10 different answers. So this is just a list of what we thought were important characteristics that need to be considered when you're doing a restoration project, like the good work that Regina and the Land Trust has been doing here for a long time now. So some of the things we focus on here are the productivity of the site. That includes tree growth and other ecological functions that exist there. We'd also like our trees themselves to be healthy, to be high vigor trees. We like there to be a reasonable amount of diversity, genetic diversity, species diversity. We like to make sure that our soils are in good shape, they're fertile, they're not degraded, there's not a lot of erosion on the site. And also, I know a lot of people get upset when they see dead trees. And every healthy forest I know of has dead trees, both standing and trees that have fallen over. So those trees are good, leave them out there. If half of the forest is dead, maybe it's not so healthy anymore. But we've really come to embrace large wood standing and fallen out there as great habitat for birds, insects, reptiles, all kinds of biodiversity that we have values.
And just thinking of that, you know, the photo of those floodplain forests and the riparian forests along creeks, large woody debris in streams is necessary for healthy salmon populations. And that's a major goal at the Land Trust, is to work on restoring salmon habitat. So, you know, it's broadly important and really important in a specific sense to a lot of our projects.
Yeah, so many of the properties with Skagit Land Trust are integrating upland and lowland ecosystems. So this integration between terrestrial and aquatic is critical. And that also is an important function in most of the low elevation forests in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, and I know just thinking about all of the different types of properties that we have, we're aiming for a lot of very different types of healthy forests. So we have some projects on land trust properties that we're going to be talking a little bit about and can highlight some of these concepts so that folks have a better understanding when we're looking at what's happening on these properties, what's threatening a healthy forest from, or preventing it from developing, and what can we do to help move forests towards a future where we think that they should be and where they'll be healthy and filling a role where they can support a diverse native ecological community.
Yeah, and I really applaud the Land Trust work because you've really taken on some big projects. I mean, starting from scratch, starting from pasture land and making a forest out of it, which was what was there to begin with. And again, there's no recipe for this. There's no formula. So I know you're trying lots of different things.
Yeah, we're relying on a lot of good knowledge that's out there already, and work that people have done to understand what can, lead to the kind of landscape that we want it to be. But at some point, you just need to jump in and try things out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us about the Topryan site?
Yeah. So you're looking at some photos and maybe some photos of the Topryan conservation area. Folks might be familiar with it. It's one of the Land Trust's earliest protected conservation areas, and it's located at the confluence of Swede Creek and the Samish River. And this property was donated to the Land Trust, and it had been agricultural fields before the Land Trust acquired it. So the first step of restoring forest on a property that had been converted into ag fields is just going out there and trying to get native plants established. So before my time at the Land Trust, there were some great projects focused on getting plants in the ground. But there are challenges anytime that you have a planting. And so at Topryan, you can see you're planting in grass, and grass competes with trees. So you have to do things to try and help those trees survive. We also had heavy beaver predation at this site. And so you can see folks working on a beaver exclusion fence to try and help those trees make it till they're big enough that the beavers can't take them out as easily. So they'll still take some out, but dead trees are good in some ways. The photo of folks working on a gate, if you look past that, you can see those trees are about 10 years old in that photo that are behind Michael. So that's an area where a lot of conifers were planted and started maturing. And the conifers, once we got those beaver fences up, did really well. And then in some of the other photos, you can see what happens as those conifer stands mature and keep doing well until they start to outcompete each other. And when you look into the understory, there's nothing else there, and the trees are becoming stressed, and they're competing too much for resources. There's not enough water potentially into the future, especially with climate change. And when trees are stressed, that can make them more susceptible to diseases or insect outbreaks. And this next slide is showing kind of what we tried to do out at Topryan. So the first step for us is always going out and getting to know our site. It's going out and watching it through the seasons so that we can understand what's really happening out there and so that we anticipate problems before they become problems. The slide with all of us in our orange hats is me and Mark and Dave out there looking at the stand of really dense conifers and deciding what needs to happen next. So we implemented a thinning project where we went in and we thinned out a large portion of those conifers that had done really well. And we actually thinned them out to open up more space and increase the diversity and other species that are present in that stand and increase the availability of sunlight and reduce competition for resources like water on the site. So in those photos, you can see some of what we were trying. We cut some of the trees down and we girdled some of them. And it really opened the site up, allowed sunlight in, put some of that woody debris on the ground. And the photo on the right side of your screen is showing what it looks like a year later. Some of the trees that we left, they're now doing better. They're growing faster. And the hardwoods are mixed in with those conifers now. So it's you get that diversity. You have different sizes and species. And the forest is going to start getting to a point where it can keep maturing and get a little healthier moving forward. And then we did a similar project at one of our Day Creek properties where we went out, evaluated the site with some foresters and folks who know a lot about trees and how to find signs of stress and what we might want to do with them. And this was another site where we'd gone out and established a dense restoration planting in an area that had been an agricultural field. And the photos at the bottom show the trees were even larger here. And again, they were really, they were dying back. So if you look at the trees in these stands, I didn't have photos that showed it very well, but you have dieback where the lower branches are all dying back towards the canopy. And when the tree dies back too much towards the canopy, it's a sign that the tree is not healthy and might not make it into the future. So our goal was to go through and reduce that competition. And so we went through and a WCC crew helped thin some of those trees and volunteers helped girdle some of the trees. And we're excited to see what that looks like next year because we just did that a couple months ago.
You know, Regina, the thing I love about these projects that you're highlighting here is your attention to detail.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe 15, 20 years ago in the field of restoration, we would do some plantings and then walk away from it. But you do regular monitoring, you're tracking the health of these stands, and you're not afraid to do active management on these stands. If we let nature take its course in some of these situations, the forest would end up not quite as healthy because if they're too dense, you know, a lot more of those trees would die out there. So I really, really give you credit for doing that. That monitoring is a key component of all these restoration projects. And being willing to adjust the density of those stands is critical because although during a winter like this wet winter we've had, it's hard to imagine the summer will ever come.
Right.
But summers are always dry,
Yep.
even on the west side. And that's the biggest challenge these trees face in getting established.
Yep. Yeah, and we've seen that, you know, there are sites where we've had trees dying over the last few years because of the cumulative drought stress. I know a lot of members and landowners have reached out to us because they've observed that happening on different sites. So we're really trying to be proactive and anticipating what problems are coming. And when we're talking about the importance of monitoring, I think that's another spot where I really have to highlight the importance of our volunteer support because again, so often we hear from our land stewards first when they say, I think we should look at this more carefully. They really go out, they get to know a property, and then they can often tell after some time there if something's wrong, they can come to us and flag it for staff. And we try to keep our eyes open and on top of all these things, but we really appreciate that volunteer support as well for finding these sites where we need to take that active management forward. Another property that I'd like to highlight is our Diopsid Creek property. And I'll wait just 1 second because there's a train coming. Just in case you all can hear it. And the Diopsid Creek property is a property we acquired just a couple years ago. It's on Diopsid Creek up Highway 20 past Marble Mount. And it's a beautiful property. We've done some work out there because there was a home in really poor condition and kind of a home site that was impacted and had been cleared of trees. So there's a lot of mature forest that's in great shape on the property, but there were some openings that we wanted to do some work. So we went out and looked at the site, and there's a lot of native vegetation already present around the site. There's great diverse species. So our goal in this site was just to try to establish some pioneer tree species to help start filling it in. And then we were wanting to rely on some of the shrubs around it to volunteer themselves in. So with that in mind, we decided to stick with just one species that we were planting, Douglas fir, which is pretty drought tolerant. And the site can get really dry in the summer. But we used some tools out there that folks might be interested in. We used a seed lot selection tool, which is a great tool that's been developed and can help people understand. So you can look up and try to anticipate with climate change what the likely conditions are going to be on a site in, 50 years, 100 years. Trees live a long time. The Douglas firs we plant on this property are going to be around 50 years, 100 years in the future, hoping. And so we want to find trees that are going to thrive in the conditions, both at the time that we're planting them and that 50 or 100 years into the future. So we can use this tool to run a model and get an understanding of where we should source our seeds from right now so that they match the conditions that the site will be experiencing into the future. And so on this site, we did this. We identified a couple of scenarios to get a range of seed sources out there. And we planted a native tree, but that's sourced from a wider range than just the Skagit Valley. And hopefully that helps make this a more resilient site where the trees are going to do better in the long run. And it was exciting to use this tool.
Yeah, so this is a great example of how you're looking ahead, not just what is here today, what was here in the past, but we know conditions are changing. We'll be facing this sort of non-analog climate future. So we don't know exactly what that looks like, but we can make some general guesses and try to adjust our management accordingly.
Yep, and that's important. We always have a management plan for our properties, and anyone who has land that they're managing, it's really a great thing to create a management plan and articulate the vision and goals you have for your own property. And going through that process and learning more about the place that you are in is important for understanding, what is a healthy forest and what's threatening that forest, and what can you do. So I'd encourage anyone who has property that they want to manage well to put the time in to create that plan.
Yeah.
And then the adaptive element is really important too. We go through and we review our management plans and update them about every 10 years. So try to do it regularly. It would be great to do it even more often sometimes, but we've got a lot of conservation areas, so there's only so many we can do a year.
You have to have a plan if you're going to know where you're going. You have to have a roadmap, and you have to get boots on the ground if possible, because you can't do it by Zoom.
Yep.
Right. So we mentioned just a few minutes ago about the effects of dry summers on these forests. Now, that's a very important point I'm leading off on with this list here of some of the things that can challenge what we might consider a healthy forest. So we always have dry summers, but since 2015, we've had a few summers that were exceptionally dry, including 2021. We had almost 3 months with essentially little or no rain. So that is stressful for trees. It doesn't matter how much rain we get in the winter, by the time you get to August, all that water is used up, and then you get what you get in the summer. So that's our biggest concern. And as we get into more of a climate change situation with warmer summers, longer droughts, that's going to be our biggest challenge. And then how those droughts might relate to other kinds of disturbances, insects, wildfires, those sorts of things. Almost all of our lands have a significant amount of invasive species already there. We anticipate these will become perhaps a bit worse and worse over time. So wherever we do have these forest stands that have high densities, those are the places that will be most sensitive. I call that the climate change bottleneck. There's only so many straws you can put in the glass out there, and you have to remove a few of those straws so more of the trees have more of the water. And then Regina showed that slide of the seedling with the protector around it. We can't forget about the things we need to be doing anyway, protecting against deer, beavers. We love these animals, right? But they're really challenging. They like to eat young trees, and so we have to find that balance out there. Any other kinds of stressors that might be available, we need to eliminate. So if there's soil erosion or some other kind of local issue, let's take care of that as well, including the invasive species. And then you ended with your point there on long-term management. That is always the focus. We can adjust. I would think it's safe to say that not everything turned out exactly as you had hoped.
For sure.
But then you had options. You could turn, take another pathway, and that's a sign of a good resource manager. When you have some other tools in your toolkit, you're not just locked into this one linear way of thinking.
Yeah. And it really is, that adapting as you go and learning from every project that you do on a site is so important. At Topryan, I think we talked about this a little bit, but I think we've done 3 different rounds of plantings out there to kind of lock in. And I think that this most recent round of planting is going to be really successful because we've learned so much from the first 2 that we did. And every time that you go out and you do something on a property, you're learning from it and you're adapting and tweaking the techniques that you use, your species list, your understanding of what will actually keep a beaver from eating your trees. And so as we've done projects over the years and learn a little bit from each project and each person that we work with, we're just getting more and more successful as we've been able to go on.
So you're describing what we've called for many years now, the adaptive management.
Yep.
But I'm starting to use the term, what we're really doing is building resilience.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what you call it, it's the same process. But we think about resilience more in the future because we know we can't hold off things like climate change. It's going to get hotter, it's going to get drier. So what are the things that we can do to ensure that we always have forests out there? And so we can take a look at some of the characteristics of healthy forests as a bit of a target for the future. Now, Regina already mentioned this idea of having a management plan. So that's the number one thing. You absolutely have to have that, but then you also have to read it frequently and revise it as needed. And also to communicate with your neighbors or the larger community of practice and restoration, which Regina is part of here. There's a big group of people doing these kinds of projects in Western Washington, and they really talk to each other quite a bit and communicate their successes and failures. And then that's how we are able to build resilience at large spatial scales, not just acre by acre. So some of the things that we'd like to focus on in terms of building resilience here are to ensure that our stand densities are appropriate for the site. There's no formula for this. Every site is different, every soil is different, so we have to pay attention to that. We need to have sufficient diversity out there so that we enable the forest stands to respond to whatever changes may come in the future in climate or other characteristics. And you mentioned this idea of expanding the genetic composition of your plantings. This is a brand new thing, and there's very little scientific data to support our managers out there on the ground. But we're trying some things. We're seeing what works out there with genetics, with species, and the structural diversity. So we aren't just planting trees in rows. We kind of screwed up the diversity by planting monocultures all over the Western Washington landscape in the past. And now we're trying to kind of rev up that diversity back to at least some semblance of what it used to be. Making sure we use species that are tolerant of low soil moisture. So that might mean, well, maybe we switch species a little bit, maybe not too far. We may not want to be transporting species around hundreds of miles where they haven't grown before, but to gradually kind of work this in, do some experiments. Control that herbivory, as we mentioned before, and then just do a really great job on monitoring. We cannot expect to predict what's going to happen 20 years, 40 years, or certainly not 100 years from now. But if we have conditions out there in the landscape where the trees can survive a good dry summer here on the west side, that's a good basis, a good foundation for having a long-term, mature, resilient forest.
Well put, Dave.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we'd love to open up for some questions, and we're happy to answer them. If folks would like to drop some questions in the Zoom chat, we'll be getting them and seeing if we can answer them and doing our best. Yeah.
We're scrolling back through to find them.
It sounds like there's already a few questions, so now we're just finding them in the list of questions.
First question, what is genetic diversity?
What is genetic diversity? That's a great question.
Okay, well, I can start that conversation on what is genetic diversity. So that simply addresses the scope of what's in the DNA of trees. You know, we may have heard of the Human Genome Project. We know quite a bit about the genetics of most of our common tree species based on decades of research over time, both in terms of digging into the microbiology of it, but also into how that genetic composition relates to the growth characteristics of trees. In general, the more diversity that we have in an organism, the greater capacity it will have to adapt to various conditions. There are exceptions to that, but that's why we emphasize this topic so much. We have, in general, over the last 40, 50 years, been planting tree species that have been grown for nursery stock in the same area where we're planting. And now we're saying, hold the phone, we're going to start expanding that. We might want to plant trees that have been grown from genetic stock farther south. with the idea that they may be more tolerant of warmer, drier conditions. So this is one way we can gradually expand the genetic diversity even within species.
Yeah. And, just to give a little more context, when I was talking about expanding the genetic diversity of the species at Diopsid Creek, after running the models and looking at kind of what was recommended for different areas, the trees that we planted at Diopsid Creek were from stock from the Willamette Valley and from southern Washington. So a couple different areas, but it doesn't take having to go very far to get that diversity that you could really help your trees in the future.
That's right. And we need to do some good monitoring on these trees now.
Yep.
And see how they perform in the future.
Yeah.
Then we can make recommendations to other people.
Yep.
We have a question. Has the perspective changed about how dense to plant trees initially in a restoration project?
Yeah, so the question was, has the perspective changed on how dense to plant trees in a restoration project? And that is an open topic right now. People are really discussing that. And the thought is, well, if we don't want our eventual stand densities to be so high because of this limitation on water, maybe we should just plant fewer trees. Whether or not that's appropriate depends a lot on the soils. It depends a lot on your objectives for the site in terms of what kinds of structural characteristics do you want in those stands. The one benefit of planting at relatively high densities is that it gives you options. Number one, in case not all of your seedlings survive. And number two, if you do go back in there and reduce or modify the densities, you get to make some choices as to how you do that, not just the number of trees, but the spatial configuration of the ultimate densities that are growing there. We're using this variable density concept more nowadays in forest management to increase habitat diversity for different types of animal species.
I have a couple more questions. These are going to combine two here. Are there rare tree species or different kinds of mycorrhizae that we might consider planting more of given the change in climate?
That's an interesting question.
So
Yeah.
this is a question that's asked often. It's should we be planting some other species? And we can look outside the window and anywhere in the town, we can see these beautiful redwoods. We see beautiful giant sequoias. We see other trees that don't grow around here. And so, why wouldn't we plant those? And I think at least at this point in time, it's good to be cautious about moving trees too far. There's a couple of things that can happen if you transfer plants too far. Number one is they may bring some diseases and insects with them that the local tree species are not adapted to. And vice versa, the trees that we're moving may be sensitive to local pathogens and insects. And sometimes we don't know the answer to that question until we plant a lot of trees. If we see a redwood here or there planted around town, they're probably fine. But what happens when we plant hundreds or thousands of trees? We don't always know the answer to that question. So my response is be cautious. If we extend the range of tree species, let's do that maybe within 100 miles or so, but not 500 miles, at least until we have more scientific data that will support our decisions to do that sort of thing.
I have a follow-up from that question asker. Seeing they were asking about trees that we would expect to find locally, but aren't very common right now.
Yeah, so which of our local trees aren't particularly common? I had mentioned earlier about how we have modified the diversity of forests through timber harvest, and then a lot of the areas were not replanted. Where they were replanted, it was primarily Douglas fir, and we neglected some species. Sitka spruce is one on wetter sites. It was not perceived as a high value species, although it did have some values at some points in time. Western white pine is another one that has been neglected. So I always encourage people to plant Western white pine on drier, sunnier sites, knowing that you have to deal with this thing called white pine blister rust, which is an exotic pathogen that's very challenging. So you have to pay attention to that. And then there's all the understory species, Pacific dogwood, cascara, Some of our less common species in wetlands like Pacific crabapple, black hawthorn. So these are some of our great native species that I don't even see planted very often in areas where people are really pretty keen on conservation and biodiversity.
Right.
But the good thing is our conservation districts have amazing plant sales.
Mhm.
Between Skagit County, Snohomish County, you can get just about everything you need. There's a number of private nurseries too that supply these things. So I like to keep those in the mix as well.
Yeah, I do think that on a lot of restoration sites, there's a bias towards, some people call them restoration superstars. So plants that people feel more confident will do well. And I think it's good, sometimes you need that. If a site is challenging, you need something that will survive. But I think it's good as a practice for us to, adapt down the road. Maybe some of those species are not going to do well if you try to plant them directly into an open grassy field.
Right.
But they might do well if you go in 20 years later when you thin out some patches and create gaps in the canopy, and you could plant them at that time and help reintroduce that diversity then. I think thinking about it on a longer time scale gives you more flexibility to make it work as well. If you try planting some of those species, they won't make it initially, but down the road, there's hope. Yeah.
And Regina, I want to put in a good word for a species that is getting a bad reputation lately, and that's Western red cedar. Because a lot of us saw Western red cedars that were suffering or even died since 2015 after that series of hot, dry summers. But I think there's still a great place for Western red cedar in our local forest. You just have to be attentive to the site.
Yep.
So Western red cedar, I think, will generally always be a good option on north-facing aspects, in drainages, places where there tends to be higher soil moisture.
Mhm.
So I think all of our native species should still be in consideration, even if the climate is getting warmer. We just have to pay even more attention to the finer scales of restoration and tree planting.
Definitely. And that, I think, goes back to knowing your site and exploring your site before you do the planting and finding those microsites
Absolutely.
to make use of them.
Absolutely.
Just-
Yeah, there's no substitute for knowing your land.
Yep.
And checking it often because things change.
And we have one last follow-up to the mycorrhizae question, which is, are there some that are better adapted to drier conditions than others that are native?
Yeah, so the question was about mycorrhizae. Are there some that are better adapted to drier conditions? And first of all, mycorrhizae are an extremely diverse group of organisms. Mycorrhizae are a fungi that facilitate transfer of nutrients from the soil into the roots of plants. There's almost no plant out in the woods that doesn't have some type of mycorrhizal association. And so there's been a lot of concern about how that might be affected by a warmer climate. And there certainly are some strains that are more or less drought tolerant. But the key is, to which species are they associated? Some mycorrhizae are rather specifically associated with individual species. Some mycorrhizae are more generalists, and they can associate with multiple species. And we don't know a lot about how that all works in general. But I think it's something to pay attention to. It's another thing that you could add to your monitoring list
Yeah,
in the future to do some soil sampling.
would be really interesting.
Check out the soil microbiota. And again, this is something we need more scientific data on to really make a good statement about it.
And there's some really exciting and innovative research happening right now. So people are learning a lot and finding, there's a lot of potential applications outside of creating resilient forests. So I think that there's a lot of attention that will benefit our efforts to manage forests more responsibly and kind of with that in mind in the future too. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for chatting with me tonight and for helping everyone learn a little bit more about healthy forests in our area.
And thank you for your good work at the Land Trust here.
Thank you, Dave.
You're welcome.